So first of all, I'd like to welcome you all to the MESCA reading group. We were very much delighted to read Dr. Katie Moylan's paper, Coming to Voice, Community Radio Production as Critical Pedagogy. And we are delighted to have Katie here with us this evening. And Katie has decided she's going to introduce herself. And we're delighted to have Katie introduce herself, her paper, how she came about researching this, and it's going to be a great session. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Katie. Thank you, Katie.
Hello, everybody. And really, thanks so much for your interest in this paper of mine, in this article, and in the research that went into it. It was something I felt very passionate about, so I'm so grateful that is kind of generated this kind of interest in other radio scholars as well. I don't have a presentation as such, so just some background, I guess, about me and how I got to this point in researching community radio as a form of pedagogy. My longstanding research interest is in radio, and in particular in community radio and the capacity in community radio for enabling self-representation of otherwise marginalized communities who are underrepresented in other forms of radio. And so I mean commercial radio, but I also mean some iterations of public service broadcasting. So this led me to my PhD research in Dublin, Ireland, looking at ways in which what were then newish migrant communities into Ireland, and I charted the ways those were variously represented in the public service broadcaster in Ireland, RTE, as versus the community sector. And what I found in that research is the community sector in Ireland was providing far more community-led programs for those migrant groups. And really, I've kept looking around at different provisions of community radio's structural kind of capacities for providing programming space for different groups who just do not get purchased or do not get heard on mainstream radio. And I found that to be the case in Ireland. I found it to be the case in the UK. The UK community radio system, as you guys will be aware, following not just Joe's work, but also Joe's excellent work charting community radio in the UK. So it is a growing sector here. This is why I should have slides. I'll just digress. Essentially, community radio remains a site for self-representation and self-determination for otherwise marginalized groups in Ireland, in the UK, in what I've found in North America, including the US and Canada. So my work isn't in any way a survey. It's not exhaustive. Rather, what I've done is looked at different locations and ways in which groups that might not be represented in that place's mainstream radio provision have purchased in community radio. So one example of that would be, say, a place like Miami, where Miami has a very strong Spanish language component, really in its commercial media as well. So it's got a very strong Spanish language radio sector. At the same time, what I found there is Haitian community radio was very well established and enabled Haitian communities to self-represent themselves in that particular economy of radio broadcasting. So ongoing interest in radio broadcasting, not just in terms of community radio, but also what does radio mean? How do we study radio as a media thing, right? So when I'm looking at community radio, I'm looking at the structures, I'm looking at the capacities that a community radio station has for communities to self-represent. But I'm also looking at things like radio textuality, the aesthetics of radio, aspects like delivery, accent, and the ways in which those two are community specific, right? So I'll go back to the Haitian example just because it's fresh in my mind right now. So for Haitian radio in Miami, what I looked at there is a movement between English and Kringlish on air, even within a sentence. So I saw Haitian community radio, which just flowed back and forth from English into Kringlish, into what they call Kringlish, that's their term, into Haitian Creole and back into French occasionally. And that is community specific. And I find that fascinating aesthetically. I find it important politically for self-representation. And I also find it broadens what we can understand as radio and radio aesthetics. So I keep looking at that. Most recently, I have finished a 2-year fellowship, EU Mary Curie fellowship, which I'm incredibly grateful to have had. And that enabled me to study Indigenous radio in what is called the US. And I could say so much about that. I have articles coming out about that, which hopefully can expand on this really important work. But in a nutshell, if I can do a nutshell, what is true of community radio in that as a sector, it remains, in what I've found, it's still under-resourced. So many programs are produced by volunteers, but at the same time, it does enable that greater kind of community-specific kind of representation. That is especially true of the Indigenous radio that I came across. In what is called the US, you have somewhere between 50 and 70 identified tribal or Indigenous radio stations, which sounds like a lot. But at the same time, as of the last official reporting, there's 574 tribes in the US alone, and those are just the federally recognized ones. So you're talking about an underrepresentative amount of stations, for example. So that, what I spent 2 years doing that, and I'll answer questions around that. Because I know that you guys are all here for the article. The article came about because in 2016, I proposed a module called Community Radio and Practice for my home institution here at the University of Leicester in the UK. So this module was a response to our media studies students, which is my field, their requests always at the point of admissions when they started studying with us. They all really, many of them expressed an interest in working in production. At the same time, I was just so interested in working in community radio, and I was forging relationships in terms of, building a network of community radio broadcasters with EVA FM here in Leicester, and that's EAVA FM, and it represents itself as a multilingual station, which indeed it is. It has programming in Somali and Swahili, in Shona, so in African languages, but also in South Asian languages, also Polish. I think they had a Spanish program, and they had a Chinese Mandarin program for a while. So we were already in contact, and I pitched this module in which our students would learn to produce a form of media, albeit radio, which was the one they're least familiar with. And I'm happy to answer questions about what do students think about radio these days. And I'm curious to hear what your experiences of this, because radio itself is changing, right? All the time, right? So, but essentially I brought to that my kind of ideas around community radio's capacities for self-representation and the ways those play out, and kind of married them with the production training provided by EVA FM, who co-run the module with me, who they're invited here tonight now. They're very busy. I don't know if they'll be able to come in, but they've said that they will try, and if they're here, Vijay and Bav might be able to answer any kind of production-led questions. I feel like I'm talking a lot and I'm getting wider in my expanse, but essentially the module has been running since 2017. It is an option module, and we have to cap the numbers because the module allows for small groups. This year, they're actually working in groups of 2. Previously, they worked in groups of 3 or 4, and they collectively, each group produces a 2-hour program, which goes live on air. And I think the challenges of liveness all by themselves are a really significant part of their experience. Many of you, if you've read the article, you'll be familiar. So I guess that's why I didn't want to present further, because you'll know where if I speak already. I'm also conscious, though, here in the UK, there are other universities running radio production programs who have been doing so for quite a while, such as University of Sunderland, Birmingham, Bedfordshire. So radio production training is a thing, absolutely, in UK academia. What I try to do with mine is put together theory and practice. And again, I'm probably not unique in doing that. But I guess what I did find is I found it so exciting what the students then did with their programs, because I asked them to consider the community they were speaking to, and that was their emphasis and how they define that community. It just opened up all kinds of things I didn't see coming. And I do feel that the module allows students to really self-represent really important, nuanced, unforeseen, contradictory, what we think is contradictory ways that reflect their experience in less mediated ways than maybe other forms of media. And I think that's its value. I fear that I digressed too much when I'm speaking, and I really welcome any questions around the structure of the module assessment, or indeed anything that you feel that the article brings up.
Not at all. That was fabulous. Thank you so much, Katie. It was really lovely. I suppose we can open the questions now to anybody that's here. So if you'd like to put on your cameras when you're asking a question, that'd be great. I have a couple of questions myself, and I know Josephine has some questions from people who had attended the reading group but couldn't attend this evening. So we'll also have some of those. So who would like to ask a question? There's my presenter and chair, Jerry Padfield, has his hand up there immediately. So thanks, Jerry.
Thanks, Katie. A couple of questions, really. I've got lots, but I'll limit it to two. So can you talk a bit about how you managed to run a module on a degree and turn that into research? Because that must be quite a difficult thing to navigate. And also I wondered, did any of the students, because as you were alluded to a little bit, a lot of young people these days don't really see radio as a medium for them. So did it change their minds? Did they see a future in radio, community radio, or otherwise?
I think I'll answer the second question first. I think so. What's really interesting about this year's cohort is they actually are much more engaged with radio as radio, which I could speak about later. But previous cohorts, absolutely, were all like, is radio not Spotify? And I'm like, not really. And it can be podcast, but not always. And so there's a lot of unpacking about first principles of radio. But in at least two cases, two of the groups went on to produce further shows for EVA FM. And actually, Vijay was telling me that one student in particular, I think, has gone back to do some more volunteer work with them. So they certainly, found a belief in the community sector and saw the value there. But they loved the experience. I think I can say to a person, they were surprised how much they loved the live experience. And that was just wonderful to see. Your question, how to translate this to a paper. I mean, the question is an ethical one, and is it, and the students referenced in the article were made anonymous. That's one of those words I can't say, like Mississippi, except I can say that one. We all have our words where we can't.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, you get the point. They were made anonymous in the article. In advance of submitting the article for the first time, I sent an email around to the students saying, I am involving, okay, this is a really important methodological question, actually, Jerry. Thanks for asking it, because you're reminding me of the process. So I had to think how I was going to do this. I was just so excited by their shows. I was like so excited by their shows. So how I assess the shows, I listened to them in the studio in real time, not in the same room, because everyone would hate that, but in a different room next to a speaker in the station. So I'm taking notes, and I was just so excited by how, not personal in terms of intimate, but personal in terms of how much of their experience was coming through. And that went through to their assessments, but it also struck me as really important. So I was like, okay, how can I talk about this? Can I talk about this? Is it right to talk about this? Will this make sense? I have an ongoing interest in critical pedagogy. I'm at the foothills of it. These days, now that we're in COVID, my interest in that has sharpened quite a lot. But I really had to read my way into critical pedagogy. That was very new to me for this article, for sure. But really beyond that, it was just, there's like, how do I involve the students? And if I were to do anything in future, I'd be much more collective. I'd involve them from the very beginning, before they even went on air, and see, if they wanted to. Because I didn't interview them, because their perspectives beyond the show aren't in there, it was very much an old-fashioned, not old-fashioned. It's textual analysis, in terms of, and you'll know that from the article. So the only analysis I do on their practice is textual readings of their shows, combined with what I thought the module was doing. So I guess I'm reading the module stuff as the module materials, the module planning as its own cultural text, I guess, and then their shows as kind of textual analysis. But I didn't involve them in terms of practitioner interviews, because it just seemed too ethically complex, and it would I actually don't know if you can do that when they're still studying. That just seemed something well beyond. That's a very long answer, Jerry. I hope that helps.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question.
So anybody else like to ask a question? I suppose I can ask you one for the moment. Katie, can I ask, did anybody not make it to the production level? You know, you said, or did all the groups get to produce a program?
Oh, everyone. Yeah. I mean, but it's a small number of students. It's a third-year module, I should say. So our degree course is a 3-year course. So by the time they hit third year, they're pretty well versed in these concepts. But it wasn't how people join the module, because we capped it initially at 15 students because EVA FM only has so many slots, and also they bring their tech to us. They bring a mobile studio to us. So there was logistics stuff to figure out, right? So the numbers are always quite small, Jude. But other than that, I didn't say you have to have these kind of grades, because we don't do that with any of our other modules. So I told people in advance when there was interest. I told students it will open at this point, and then it is first come, first serve, or first included. So I say that to kind of situate the kind of students we get, right? We didn't have students that were particularly well performing compared to other modules, right? That. Really, I think the reason, a large part of why they got to production is because they're so well trained by VJ and Bav. And VJ and Bav are just, you know, they bring students out, and they get more participation from their students than largely us academics. That's a huge generalization, but I have found that to be true. It's the hands-on, and they're just very, very good at what they do. So they all did go to air.
That's great. Thank you. Anybody else like to ask a question?
Hi.
Great, Kathy. Thanks, Kathy. I think you might have to unmute, Kathy. Sorry.
Sorry. How is everybody?
Good.
Great.
Yeah, just in terms of the module, would that have been a 5-credit module or a 10-credit? And then also in relation to assessment, so they deliver the program, or they create the content, but then do they do a reflective learning piece or something after that, or what way does that work?
Yeah. In terms of the credit numbers, I would have to check, because that's on the module spec, and I didn't turn around the module spec because it's for complicated reasons. I started back in September, so I wasn't part of that planning process. It's an option module though.
Okay, how many hours is the module?
Right. It's 3 taught hours a week, which isn't that much. It's three taught hours a week. But then when we get into production, there's an extra 3 hours for their show. Their show is 2 hours, but then there's an hour built in for transport to and from the station, and for introduction to the station, and health and safety, to be honest with you, all that kind of thing. So that's a standalone hour. But yeah, 3 contact hours a week. Assessment. So assessment remains complex, and I'm fielding questions from these students this week and last about this very thing. Assessments are broken into 3. The first and the last are done as individuals. The middle one, the biggest one of 50%, is the station, it's the show itself. So, and I nearly want to pull up the module handbook, but I think I can do it from memory. So that's 50%, and that is, they all get the same mark for that. And again, what's been remarkable is there hasn't been that thing that you can get with group work where somebody's pulling their weight more than others. I mean, I know there's a bit of that, there must be, but not where it's really injured the show itself or the relationship, you know. The first assignment I call it, it's a critical running order, okay? So, and I'm kind of hesitating because I have just had these conversations. It is both an academic piece and a production piece, okay? But it's a single thing. Now, they produce these individually, but if they're working well with their groups, they can all submit the same one. They should work on it collectively, but I'm not going to insist on it. And I guess the reason I decided to do that is because I didn't want to put artificial pressure when they already had pressure to work well together. A lot of these decisions in a way were kind of instinctive. So the running order is what I call it, a map of the show. Okay, so but I want it to show me that they've identified the community they're speaking to very clearly, that they have a very clear vision for the show. I don't insist that it absolutely be replicated when they go on air in 2 weeks after the deadline or 3 weeks after the deadline, depending on how the schedule goes. But I do want them to plan it, and I do want them to think thematically. So that's what the running order is for. The show assessment is a tricky one, right? Because it's aesthetics, it's politics, it's really me looking at it as an academic thing when it's not, and certainly not just an academic piece of work. But at the same time, it could be a beautifully produced program and really creative, but if I didn't feel it was community facing, I wouldn't be able to, give it the highest mark. So the aesthetics must serve the community facing function. At the same time, it's their first production for most of them. So really, I look at the work they're putting into it and their structure. And then the final thing is, as you're asking, it is a critical reflection, and that's completely individual again. And I asked them to reflect on how it's open-ended, as many of my reflective assignments are, and I do that to keep it creative, but that can cause anxiety in students. It's like, well, what do you want me to do? Which is valid. I just don't like to pin them down, though. In brief, I try to say, okay, how did you envisage the show, and how did you feel on air? How did you feel it was connecting? Did it connect? What were you surprised by? And how did you kind of see your own identity in the process of production, on air, and then how you felt about it afterwards? And I try to frame that preparation for them by reflective. My classes from week 9 are quite reflective, and I build at least half of that class as a reflective piece for them. So I asked them, how did you feel about your voice when you were on air, for instance? That kind of thing, and how was the experience? These are long answers, but I think for once, I think that's okay. Does that
That's
help?
great. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Great. And Michelle, thanks, Michelle, for joining us. If you'd like to ask your question.
Morning, everybody. Hello.
Thank you for getting up so early. We
I've had to go
appreciate
and
it.
top up my tea. Hello, Katie.
Hi, good morning.
I'm Michelle. I'm from Australia.
Amazing.
Katie, you talked about this program in as critical pedagogy, and I wonder if you were surprised by any of the formats that the students might have come up with. So you spoke at the beginning there about students and their association with radio, right? And do they know what radio is? And so I work with students on air at the university that I work at as well. And so I wondered if you were surprised by any kind of new formats. Did students come up with anything innovative in terms of what perhaps we might think of as the formula for making radio? Because that's what I'm really particularly interested in, is what, particularly with community radio, is, what can we perhaps do differently? So I wonder if you were surprised by what the students kind of came up with in terms of running a radio show format.
I don't know that they came up with anything creative that astounded me, only because they were unfamiliar with radio qua radio anyway. And I even find this in some community radio, sometimes they kind of lean towards a style that's more commercial because that's what they know, right? So I'm thinking about things like delivery, where it can be quite polished, more polished than, more kind of anodyne in that way. Not that polish is bad, but polish can kind of iron out kind of idiosyncrasies, and I think of richness of voice. So I think the short answer is not enormously, but I was surprised nonetheless. I'm always surprised by their content. I was saying to Joe and to Jude before we started, I looked at the article again. I hadn't looked at it for a while, just to kind of remind myself of, if you guys are, what questions you might ask. And one thing that struck me and that really led me to kind of start thinking about writing an article is content around, say, things like feminism. You know, I mean, these are young women with the Dear Uni Girls show, and I can see them, and it wasn't the most amazing show amongst, there's quite a lot of really interesting shows. I mean, I could speak about everything, other things like the young woman from the home counties and her, I think she was Czech partner. Two of them did a show based on drum and bass for 2 hours. You know, that surprised me, I guess. Yeah, but that was more content and taste and something about them, you know. But the Dear Uni Girls, just their concerns were things that I didn't see coming. And that to me is so important, because we're not gonna, because that's where they live. So they were talking about where they live and their experiences. And I felt very privileged to even hear about that. And I felt very glad that they were able to use the radio format in really self-expressive ways, because they're very different from each other in all kinds of ways, not just background wise, but more there are different values, and that kind of came into the room as well, into the studio. Does that help answer? Did I answer you fully? I don't know if I did.
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Katie. The students that I listen to, I actually hear influences of YouTube in their shows. I think the YouTube culture has really influenced the young people that I teach in terms of content and presenting content. And I sort of, some of the radio shows I hear, I go, oh, I think that's really influenced by YouTube. So perhaps not so much in Australia commercial radio. You know, I survey students and what they listen to, and they don't really listen to the radio so much, but
right?
yeah. Thank you, Katie. Thank you. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. But I think you're right about YouTube. And also, I should say, you and probably several of you, I'm not a production person first and foremost. Like, I did pirate radio myself, but I feel very much like an academic when assessing these things. So there are shortfalls in stuff that I don't see in terms of innovation. So it's anything anyone can tell me about their own experiences, production-wise and innovation-wise. I'm super curious to hear that. Thanks, Michelle.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. And do we have any other questions? I'm sure we do. Great.
I think,
is that a historical hand there? Or yeah, Josephine is there. Is that a historical hand, Jerry?
It's not. It's just, I'm sorry, Joe, but relating to what you were just talking about, actually, you and Michelle, because I've trained like over 100 people to make shows, and I've found that the people that do the less interesting shows for me are the people that are like, oh, well, I like this commercial radio show, so I'll try and make it sound like that. And the people that have come in without preconceptions, like I always think of this guy that I had that was blind and had severe learning disabilities. And so he kind of put together this amazing show, which was completely unbroadcastable, which included snippets of him peeing into different rivers. And he'd introduce it and he'd say, this is me peeing into the River Fowl. And this is me peeing into the River Kenwyn. And this is a recording of me going in and catching my mum in the shower. And she'd react like, what are you doing in here? But I couldn't put it on air, unfortunately. But it was just like, for me, that's one extreme. But when people come at it without that preconception of what it should be, is for me the most interesting thing. That's just a comment rather than a question, but I just thought it was interesting.
I think there's so much scope for that. And I was external examiner for West of Scotland's broadcast production program until this September. So I heard some of their radio content as well when I was assessing that. And there was more of that. And I wonder, this is a bigger question, I wonder, is there greater capacity for maybe that in podcasting as well as community formats? I mean, I think community formats, I agree with Michelle, that it gives you more scope for that kind of aesthetic innovation. But I've heard really innovative content from students. So far, mine aren't recording actuality like your student, Jerry, but it is an interesting way to go. It sounds amazing.
Yeah, it
Thanks.
sounds like sound art almost, Jerry.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, the extreme sound art. So Josephine, you had your hand up. Thanks, Jerry.
Yes, thank you. So it's similar to Jerry's point, but also it's something that I grapple with when I think about community radio and creating content because certainly in this country we do have broadcast standards, and I just wonder how free is it, VJ and Baz, how free they feel when they're training your students up, or whether they are training them and kind of putting some kind of framework around what's possible to make sure that they're not violating any taste.
Yeah, I do know what you mean. Yeah, and I mean there is a remit with community radio to adhere to guidelines, everything like all radio to a degree, but I mean community licenses can be more vulnerable. I don't think they are. It's Vijay and Bavik, Bav for short. Vijay Umro and Bavik Solanki, I should give them their full names, and they're in the article as well. They're very systematic though. They go right through, they start with talking about censorship and I was gonna say Oxfam, of course it's not that at all. Ofcom, thank you, hello. And they talk about remits and broadcasting standards and not swearing, obviously, and codes of conduct. They make it interesting because they're very good at what they do. They also, though, train young people beyond, I mean, they don't just train my lot, they train young people anyway. So they're very adept, I think, at kind of, negotiating the space between personal expression, especially of young people in that space to express themselves, and what's required by a community radio remit, which has to stay on air and has to adhere to, to the conditions of its code of practice and of its key commitments. Yeah, and that's part of it though, that they teach it as responsibility, as accountability, and I think that itself is an important lesson. But I mean, yeah, so I don't see it as I know what you mean in terms of a framing of this kind of content. But they haven't been innovative in terms of devising new creative modes of expression, but they have been creative and had some amazing discussions on air within that. And there's a lot of variety, a lot of diversity, not variety, within the shows that have been produced, even adhering to those. Another long answer, Joe. Thanks.
They're always, long answers are always welcome, Katie. It's great. I think, Kim, you had your hand up next, if that's okay, and then Elena.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Hey.
Joe. Hi, Kim.
Yes. So my question, I have two questions, actually. One is about the feminist approach. I mean, I think it's obvious that some feminism is going to come through the topic, but I'm wondering, were you able to incorporate feminist approaches in your research, or do you think that you did by default?
Right. That was a real question for me when I was writing it up. I was like, how should I frame this as feminist scholarship, as feminist pedagogy? And I think I bring in people like Rosalind Gill, and I bring in, more crucially, I think, Bell Hooks, I mean, I can't just put Bell Hooks in one category, I mean, she does feminism, but it's not the only thing she does, albeit she did do it very comprehensively. It's not first and foremost framed by feminist theory, no. And that is because that's a really good question that I think about really anytime I take on board something that I'm analyzing that has gender in there that is problematized or critiqued or foregrounded, which indeed, Dear Uni Girls, it is a feminist show in that it's reinforcing and reflective of the three practitioners' feminisms. It's not that these critiques in a feminist approach aren't central and important, they are, but I guess when I'm trying to approach anything, it's like, what am I trying to get at? I'm trying to get at self-representation. I'm trying to get at combating reductive representations of the communities or members of communities elsewhere. And so I go from community building outwards. I go from, I guess, potential for gaining agency for all of them. So I didn't lead with feminist approaches not that I want to put them on the side, but because there's a bunch of different things I want to investigate. And I wasn't deeply enough versed in pedagogy and critical pedagogy theory, I'm still not, to kind of invoke specifically feminist approaches. Though there are a couple, I'd have to look at the bibliography again. There's one set of approaches, I don't think it's in this article. There's Washington State University has recently done a series of self-produced, I want to say texts, and they invoke feminist pedagogy, and I can send you the reference for that because they do amazing work. I don't think I was able to invoke it here, but it's a good question. It should not be asked. I can't write about this show without being asked that question, so thank you for it.
Well, your reference section was also pretty rich with some feminist material. So I was just wondering if there was a connection. My last question is about cultural production. And I just feel like this term is so broad. Like, what is not cultural production? And so I'm wondering, in your case, how did you take this broader thing, and did you have to get your head around it in a more niche manner in order to tackle your research project?
Yeah, I mean, cultural production, transcultural production, community for that matter. I mean, I don't know about you guys, any one of us who tries to write about community and you're writing sentences after sentences after sentences, which always say community because there is no better word, but it's one of these conversational words as well. Cultural production, I mean, yeah, a cultural production could be a cultural practice, an everyday practice that has nothing to do with media, for sure. Absolutely agree with that. Okay, so on the one hand, though, when you're teaching commonplace words, and I'm not going to use terminology that's particularly academic right here, but commonplace words, conversational words like community, like culture even, I do find them useful for teaching because they're so big. And so I kind of like put them forward to, like, what do we mean when we say cultural production? And I just kind of take them apart. Like, cultural can mean anything. So what do we mean in this context? And in this case, I'm not sure if you mean like how I use it in the text, because in the text, I think I do use it the way I do with community. And then I just tried to, like, for example, like, I'm going to use community to exemplify what I want to say about what you asking me about cultural production, if that makes sense. So with community, it's like, okay, it's so big. So who do I think is important in theorizing community? So it's always David Harvey for me, or Miranda Joseph, and other people as well. Cultural production, somebody I found, I also think of a lot is Hamid Nafisi talking about transcultural production, because he led me, his work led me into thinking about accented production. So transcultural production, again, is I think what's happening with Dear Uni Girls and with so many of the shows produced by our really diverse student body. One of the things I didn't say at the beginning is Leicester has a persistently diverse, and I can explain what I mean by that, undergraduate student body. So we have a mixture of UK students, and we have other European, I'll say other European, culturally we're European, big conversation, I appreciate, but UK has been part of Europe, so people come to us from other European countries. Chinese students, Hong Kong students, and also say South Korean students, and now getting more from South Asia. So, but of our UK students, they themselves are diverse. So they might come from surrounding counties, but they might also come from London. If they come from London, more or less, they tend to be first or second generation from families from Caribbean backgrounds, but also from different African backgrounds. I say all this to answer your question because what interests me is their capacities in the classroom at the beginning of the first class of every module of transcultural production, because I can't produce a show without it being transcultural, because every group, yeah, okay, some people from the same background stick together, but increasingly they don't. So every production, every show is a transcultural production, or most of them are. So I see it through that, saying, okay, you're reproducing your experience, aspects, I won't say your identity, but your identity is there. It's infusing what you're producing. And that is, it's produced. So as a media studies scholar, everything that we are working with is produced. There's a creativity there, but there's also a distance. There's a deliberation, right? So if we produce something, there's a space. It's a product in the end. So I try to be precise with it, but I also am aware it's big, you know? Does that help at all, or did I muddy the waters?
No, that was great. Thank you for taking the time, Katie.
No, it's a great question. And thanks everybody for your interest, because it's fascinating to see what this sounds like from the outside. It's daunting.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, so Elena, thank you so much. Elena is also going to ask.
Thank you. You might partially replied to the questions that I wanted to ask, but just in general, I have two questions. Like the first one is related to the student production practice, and the second one is related to assessment as well. And the first part is I'm wondering what kind of communities students were able to represent, and what kind of groups, community groups. And the second one, also how long was each segment for each student? And in a joint show, for example, what was the requirement for each student for the duration of the segment? And the second part is what is the concept and idea of community-facing segment? What do you mean? Yeah.
And again, my students want to know this also. Okay, so everyone's always a little thrown by community facing, because I think it's fair to say that they come in and think radio first and think the community facing stuff second. And I'm okay with that, because I do think that considering what it means to speak to a community and to make them think, I say, to encourage them, but they have to actually for the module, what is a community? That this builds on stuff they've already been talking about in media studies, you know, knowledge of their background and how that intersects with their media use, stuff like reflecting on their TV use, for instance, stuff like critical distance, like their engagement with social media. I say all this to situate how they're situated coming in, okay? But I do say, because I figured out pretty quickly that community, in quotes, had to be really broadly conceived. So that's why, for instance, the two women who did the show on drum and bass, they said, we want to do a show on drum and bass. And it was one of them in particular leading. And I was like, all right, but tell me why this is a community. Really argue for me. Is there a community of listeners? Is it a community of interest, which, as we know, is a community radio category? I said, but you need to argue this for me. I said, I see what you're doing. I'm impressed by it. I think it's really cool. But I didn't say that because, you know, they still have to do the work. Community was also conceived multiple times by groups just saying community of international students in Leicester, which is super broad. So Leicester has two universities. We at Leicester University is one, but there's also Montfort. So it is a university town. It's only about 300,000 people. So it's very much a college town or university town. So it's a broad thing. International students in Leicester was a little more specific, but there's a lot of them. But that's okay, because there are things in common. If you move to Leicester from elsewhere, there was a hilarious segment actually in class where I think half the class, more of them, were not from the UK. And they're like, why are your taps separate? Why is your heating like this? So I mean, like, I was just like, use this, you know, this is like everyday practice, you know, if you want to use it. So to answer your question, community is super wide, because I appreciate that they're, and also it gets away from potentially essentialist, you know, self-representation. I'm led by them, however they want to represent themselves in their community, I'm there for them. But it's been really rare that I think I had one show where there was like two young women talking about being from the Slavic community. They talked about being from two Slavic countries, but mostly they don't go from ethnicity or that kind of situatedness. They really don't, which is interesting. Assessment wise, I am pretty qualitative, right? So this goes back to an earlier question. With a show, I don't measure who does what exactly. it is usually the case that somebody does more driving of the desk than the others. So there's always someone who's happier doing that. And that's a toss up between their learning experience. Should they both get, or three of them get equal time, or do they figure it out amongst themselves? And to be honest, I let them figure it out amongst themselves. Also, Vijay and Bav speak to them much more clearly about this because they run all that kind of thing, but I'm not going to insist on that. Similarly with the running order, you can kind of tell, is someone driving more of the idea? But to be honest, I really feel they are being meaningfully collective when they come up with their ideas. I can tell that by their conversation. I can tell it by the voice of their running order. You know, you can always tell if one person's kind of driving the writing. So again, how I assess that is, and how I make room for that, for the different levels of work and engagement, should that happen, to be fair to them. That's why the individual running order, the first assessment is individually submitted and individually assessed. Very often, 2 or 3 will submit the same one because it's the same group, but I give them the opportunity in case somebody's not pulling their weight. Similarly, and more to the point, the reflection, that's always completely individual, because that is kind of more their experience and they differ much more across. But the show itself, they all get the same grade. If there came a situation where they weren't all contributing, I would have to make some sort of change to that, but so far that hasn't happened. Does that help? I feel I'm being very,
thank you. Yes.
not precise. I pretty much trust them. You know, again, it sounds very, I'm using the word qualitative, but I'm happy to do it because I do feel they're learning and they're working hard, but I'm not pinning them to specific outputs. And now I'm feeling a little guilty for not doing that, but I don't know. But I'm glad you're asking the question, because I don't know what this
I think it is
like
difficult to. Yes, I think this is difficult to assess something that is connected to creativity. This is also my problem. Just I'm listening something and looking at something like creative and student produced, and it's very difficult to low mark, and to low grade, and this is the problem. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's like the example Jerry gave about this, what sounds like an amazing program. I mean, I get students doing some really, not really amazing innovative work, and that was Michelle's question, and I haven't seen anything that's like extraordinary aesthetically, but it's hard to look at a program and say that's not good enough. It's a really strange thing that hasn't really happened. So thanks for a good question. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Elena. So I think, Kathy, your hand is up, and it may be a historical hand.
Yeah, it's an old hand.
Okay, thanks a million. A lovely old hand. Listen, Josephine has just gone up there. So Joe, have you another question?
I do, thank you. Because I've just been looking through the article where we made notes when we were discussing it. And I remember those of us that were discussing it first time around really enjoyed the way that you described the shows, Katie, and we felt that your intonation really helped, but we did find ourselves yearning to actually hear some of the content for ourselves. I'm wondering if you've thought about, or if we could, you know, is this stuff posted somewhere, or does that pose yet more ethical issues?
It does pose ethical issues for sure, but it's worth investigating for sure, because I feel like I'm not going to answer for them, and I certainly won't, you know, I have to pursue it, but in terms of how to frame this ethically with them. But I think off the top of my head, I think most of them would be happy to have that made accessible. Something I did think about in advance of talking to you all, I made some notes about like, what would I do if I had to do it again or do this in future? And one of the things I would do, I think I said earlier, I would be much more collaborative from the start, but I would think of ways. This is an open access article, and that's something I'm committed to. And I should have been doing this all along. If you're writing about community facing work, community radio, it should all be open access. If you can do that, and that can be difficult. And I appreciate there are publishing loopholes and difficulties. So I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but it's something I'm trying to do if I can. In the same spirit though, Joe, another long answer, sorry. I think that'd be amazing. And I think that would also give, you know, anything any of us can do to amplify what this thing is called community radio and how super diverse it is. Like, there are so many commonalities, as we know, between community radio structures and informing policies. But there are all, because it's community specific, there's so much genuine difference of content. So if I can amplify any of that by sharing it. So I'm going to make a note, Joe, if I do this in future, I would love to do that. Obviously, and I think there'd be the students would say yes or no, and they're the important people. And then there's my institution, which are also important. But you know, it's kind of like the institution has its ethical framework, and then there's the people involved who actually are involved in that, if that makes sense.
I suppose that's great. Thanks, Joe. Katie, can I just ask you then, before Michelle comes in there, if they're actually producing something live, you know, do they not have to sign off on allowing it being broadcast? And is this the real difference between a podcast and a broadcast? Because a podcast is a natural archive. So, you know, are there issues around community radio that, you know, you could maybe tie it in with that? Just an observation.
No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, anything that's broadcast live, it is in the public domain. And I found that is how I'm able to research community radio, because I listen to current community radio. That's what I do. So yeah, so you could argue it's in the public domain. Also, what they do at EVA FM is they keep their own archive.
Yes.
So part of our agreement with them is they keep all of the shows, and they also take photographs of the students so that they can talk about that interaction, and that all requires ethical kind of signing off, and that's very formalized, and so it should be, because students, everyone has to be protected in this regard. But yeah, so the texts are out there. Yeah, it's just, you know, how are they going to be? I mean, yeah, you could argue they're already in the public domain, but I would never, like, if I was connecting them to an article.
But they're not anonymous when they go live.
Right? No, that's true.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
no,
true.
just an observation. So I suppose it would be just agreeing to, you know, I suppose it's between universities then and yourself.
Well, and also, sorry, Jet. Sorry.
No, that's it. Go for it. Yeah.
Well, just, you know, it's this is a thing that comes up if you're researching radio in this current and not historical. It's radio as text, right? I mean, because live radio is live radio, and that really should be the only way we experience it. And so that's why when I assess them in the studio in real time and take notes in real time, because I want it to hit me as it would hit me in real time. So in theory, once you airlift it as a text, because the station will keep records, it then becomes something else. You know what I mean?
Of course, yeah.
But I mean, I don't think these are obstacles, but they do exist as kind of like different ways of thinking about these radio texts. But I do love the idea of sharing them as part of future research.
Yeah, because I think it would add a richness to the piece as well when you can go and listen. It's always, but I suppose we're all very audio, you know, I suppose guided and love audio, so it would be, you know, interesting for us. That's
but it's true. They're great programs. Seriously. I mean, half the time I'm sitting there like, hey, you know, and they can't see my face when I'm doing that. That's the whole point. So yeah,
which is great. Michelle, and I'm realizing that we're getting late. So if anybody has a very quick question after Michelle, we might make that the last one. I don't want to delay you at all, Katie. Hi, Michelle. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for this session. It's been really great, and I've been scribbling down heaps of notes. Katie, I'm concerned with place. My PhD research is concerned with place, and so the thing about place and community is that they're not fixed. Community is not fixed. Community changes, and so I was wondering if you plan to do kind of a longitudinal study of this program to compare how those community-facing programs might change over the years as the community of the place changes over the years. So do you have any plans to kind of do a longitudinal study of this program?
No, but I might now. Again, it really was just kind of an impulse. I was like, I wanted to see, can I write about this, and would a journal take it? And what would that look like? But I think that's a really good question. I also think it ties into something I'm observing now with COVID, which I think you guys probably found something similar. Radio has changed, of course, with the pandemic. I say, of course, I should never say, of course, no teacher should, but I do feel it's changed so much. And place, as you say, Michelle, and locality has ever been important to community radio, because it speaks from shared, like we all know the coffee shop, we all know the landscape, we all look out the window for the weather. You know, those things are so important and so resonant. And I think with COVID, they've become more so again, or freshly so, because alongside that, there's been the requirement of local radio to provide testing information, logistical information early in the pandemic, stuff like shopping hours. And I don't mean to veer from your thing. I want to come back to that because I feel something. I've got this idea that radio is a place where we could mine an archive of the pandemic right now, because it's a place where these things have been recorded. So it's something I'm kind of developing. But that goes to something you're talking about as well. It's like to archive changes in what it means to be a student, a transcultural student, maybe from different students in different places, physically and otherwise, belonging-wise, values-wise. You know, coalescing in this module, making programs, and how do those programs change? Because see, Leicester, Eve FM, like anywhere, is very much of Leicester, but it's also of kind of the people each producing their programs and the backgrounds they come from, because they're not all born and raised in Leicester, you know, like me. So I love this idea of a study, but I'm kind of translating in my head as you ask, to an archive of like, what are our students doing and how are they changing, and how is that evidenced? How is that shown, expressed in these shows? So I now have two really awesome ideas, you guys. Thank you. But one thing we could always think about, which I'm increasingly curious, is comparative stuff, right? If we could all maybe doing something similar where we compare our experiences and maybe theorize our differences in teaching, because I think you guys, if you're teaching production, I'm not teaching production qua production. So yeah, maybe we could talk about developing a kind of comparative study, wide and deep study, as they say. I hope that was helpful.
I'm in, and I think it's really interesting to, and I've said this, you know, in this group for many years, I think it's really interesting also to compare the UK and the Australian community radio sector.
Yes, yeah. And you're right. It's that is like one of the first things I ever came across in radio theory, radio studies, way back in Melbourne in, what was it, 2006, I want to say, the radio conference there is where I first came across the rich thing that is Australian community radio. That's been built into your media ecology for much longer, I think, than it has here, I believe.
That's great. Thanks so much, Michelle. We've got
Michelle,
a lovely comment here from Kim saying that she loves hearing your approach to open access, and that journals aren't helpful enough in this regard, really.
No,
you know.
I feel very strongly about open access, and I can send some links. There's discussion groups around open access. It's a weird analogy, but it's kind of like health insurances in the US, because open access is a wonderful principle, and healthcare for all is an important, both are essential, I think. But because you're still being driven by businesses and publishers are still businesses, it's still hard to navigate how to gain open access. And if you're dependent as an academic on published material and the journal accepts your article and you're really happy with that journal, but they won't do open access, yeah, you're stuck. Yeah. I think there's a slow movement towards more open access. But yeah, I think it's important, but it's not always easy. So I have some resources I can try and share them. They're not radio specific though.
That'd be great. Thanks, Katie. Well, I suppose we will round it off there, because you've really graciously given us a lot of time, a full hour there. And it's been really a rich, discussion, and we have a very international group here as well this evening. Yeah, it's been fantastic to see so many people from all the different areas. So thank you so much for accommodating us and the MeCCSA reading group. It's been brilliant. And I know we spoke about Australia, but our next meeting that we have is on the 21st of February, Monday the 21st. And that one is a really interesting, you spoke about Australian radio. This one is New Zealand, and it's Dr. Bronwyn Beattie and Dr. Brian Pauling. And it's a unique and forward-looking sector reflecting on 30 years of community access radio in Aotearoa, in New Zealand. So we'd like to welcome you all back then on the 21st, but specifically to yourself, Katie, thank you so much. It has been a lovely hour.
Thank you, everybody, for your really great questions and for having such an interest in this. It's amazing. It's amazing to talk about this stuff with people who are also studying this and involved in this. And it's lovely to meet you all again and see those of you who I've met before. So thanks all for your comments so much and your questions.
Thank
and if
you
you have
so
follow-up
much.
for me, email me and I'll try to help with anything else you might have to ask.
You're very kind and gracious. Thank you so much. Lots of great thank yous and lovely to see you there in the comments. So thanks a million, Katie.